All right. Namo tasso bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasam. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasam. Namo tasso bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhasam. In English, I take refuge in the Buddha, the potential for awakening in this life. I take refuge in the Dharma, the way of understanding and love. I take refuge in the Sangha, the community that lives in harmony and awareness. Buddham saranam gacchami, Dhammam saranam gacchami, Sangham saranam gacchami, Dutiyampi Buddham saranam gacchami, Dutiyampi Dharman saranam gacchami, Dutiyampi Sangham saranam gacchami, Tatyampi Buddham saranam gacchami, Tatyampi Dharman saranam gacchami, Tatyampi Sangham saranam gacchami. The Dharma is deep and lovely. We now have a chance to see it, study it, and practice it. We vow to realize its true meaning. Perhaps just letting these chants, these words soak in. To help us arrive. I like to enhance my arrival by just feeling the soles of the feet on the floor or cushion, the sit bones on the bench, cushion, or chair. Just allowing myself to come into presence, phenomenological presence. Just allowing myself to be with phenomena arising and falling. Nothing more, nothing less. You want to take a moment to just scan the body. Just check if there are any areas of discomfort, pressure, tingling, heat. Seeing if there's a need to make any micro adjustments to the posture. Or if not, perhaps to invite those areas to soften, release, and relax. Soften, release, and relax. And then just watching, ideally without judgment, without expectation, just watching what unfolds. If you haven't already, you may wish to choose an anchor to come back to as the mind inevitably wanders. Perhaps the breath, at the tip of the nose, chest, abdomen, perhaps sensations in the hands, sound, or perhaps you want to practice metaphrases. And I offer you an inquiry for tonight's meditation. It's actually the title of a book by Ayakima. Who is myself? Who is meditating? Is this a constant study? Who is meditating? Is it impermanent, changing, arising, falling? Perhaps you can hold this inquiry lightly, or perhaps you want to make it almost like an anchor, coming back to this, who is myself? Who is meditating? Is who even the right pronoun, the right word to be using? Does who suggest an object? What if it's an unfolding process, this who? Perhaps we tend to automatically think of that who as static, to steady and consistent. So just to perhaps carry that inquiry with you. Or if you wish, think of it just as an invitation. Feel free to let it go and to just perhaps focus on the breath, open awareness, whatever feels right. And a final piece of guidance that when the mind wanders, as our minds are wont to do, and we recognize, the mind has wandered, can we, first of all, check in and see how are we relating to that recognition? Is it a sense of or is it a sense perhaps of subtle disappointment, judgment, evaluation? Or can it be a recognition, mind has wandered? Can I then release the worry, the planning, whatever it may be, almost like you have a ball in your hand and you're just relaxing the fingers and letting it release? And then often when the mind has wandered, we tend to tense up. Can we just relax the body? Can we re-smile? Can we bring a subtle smile to the lips, to the eyes? And then, having in a sense set these conditions, perhaps then we can be ready to return to the breath, body sensations, sound, metaphrases, open awareness, the inquiry. So we return, knowing full well that we likely will be repeating this again and again as the mind wanders. I think of this as the compassion part of this meditation practice. How we treat ourselves, the meditator, how we treat ourselves when we become aware that the mind has wandered. May our practice this evening be of benefit to all beings. May all beings be happy. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings experience joy, both of the good fortune of others and of themselves. And may all beings accept life's unfoldings, just as they are, with equanimity. May all beings awaken and be free. Welcome back. I invite you all to turn on your video. It frankly helps me as the teacher to see how you're receiving what's going on. Are you like, or are you, anyway, so plus it's nice for everybody to be able to see each other. Okay. All right, I realized I didn't properly introduce myself initially. I am Jeff Rosenberg. I'm a teacher with the Insight Meditation Community of Washington, IMCW, and I will leave it at that. So I have to start, maybe this isn't the right way to start a talk, but I think I may need to explain my title. It's like explaining a joke or something. How many of you are familiar with the advertisement that goes, Certs is a candy mint, Certs is a breath mint, Certs is a candy mint, Certs is a breath mint. Stop, you're both right. Not too many are familiar with this. This shows my age. So the idea is the notion that Certs, the candy mint, or the breath mint is actually both put together in this marvelous mint. So the title of my talk is Letting Go of Self, Cultivating Wholesome Sense of Self. Letting go of self, cultivating self. Letting go of self, cultivating self. Stop, you're both right. Okay? And what I mean by this is letting go of self rather than being in competition with cultivating self. Actually, the two of them complement each other, reinforce each other. And so hopefully you'll get some sense of that through the talk. And along the way, perhaps we'll talk a little bit about spiritual bypass and a little bit more detail about the idea of ownership. Okay? So that is where we will go to this evening. So, God, now it feels like, I guess it's several years ago, I wrote a chapter in a book, and the chapter was entitled Identity, Flexibility, and Buddhism. And an alternative title that I came up with later, which I didn't use in the book, was Anatta from the Inside Out. For those, perhaps you all are familiar with the idea of anatta, one of the three, usually the third characteristic of existence, impermanence, dukkha, and then anatta. They sometimes translate it as non-self, the idea of no permanent self. So we'll just leave it at that. We could obviously talk the whole night about that. But let's start with this idea of identity. So we could think of identity as, if you will, a self, a conditioned self that has certain tendencies. And so somebody, for example, might be someone who you ask them something and they have to kind of think about it and think through every angle and so forth. And you're like, geez, I just would like a decision here. Somebody else might be relatively impulsive, what I like to call the fire ready aim, if you're familiar with that idea that, and oh, wait a minute, what happened to the ready aim part? So the point being, we have certain tendencies. And then the question is, can we over time, perhaps through our practice and so forth, develop greater flexibility? And the more flexibility we develop, well, wait a minute, who am I now? I'm the person who was the fire ready aim, but now there are times I actually recognize that I pause and I reflect for a bit before I give an answer, or whatever. No, I'm the one who's obsessive. And no, now there are times I realize I need to just, come up with an answer. So the idea is that you kind of start turning this inside out, and the notion of what is myself starts to get a little bit dicey. It doesn't seem quite so certain anymore that I'm this type of person or that type of person. Okay? Here's how Evan Thompson states it, which is beautiful, I think. He says, the self, quote, is an experiential process that is subject to constant change. We enact a self in the process of awareness, and this self comes and goes depending on how we are aware. More simply stated, the self isn't a thing or an entity, it's a process. Maybe I should read that again. The self is an experiential process that is subject to constant change. We enact a self in the process of awareness, and this self comes and goes depending on how we are aware. More simply stated, the self isn't a thing or an entity, it's a process. So, a process, it's constructed, deconstructed, constructed, deconstructed. Okay? It's not a thing, it's not an entity, is what he's saying. So let me give an example of this, because I think this is a fairly hard one in some ways to swallow. It's not our way of normally thinking about ourself. So I was many years ago at a death and dying workshop. It's the kind of thing us Buddhists get into, right? And so I'm at this death and dying workshop, beautiful, outside of Frederick, Maryland, know the teachers. I feel very safe there. And I'm paired up with someone for one of the exercises. And this is somebody I actually know. His name was John. He's a retired NIH scientist and so on and so forth. And as I'm sitting there with John, I realize I'm feeling smug. Smugness has arisen. It's not a usual feeling of mine. But here I am at a Vipassana-related death and dying workshop. So smugness has arisen. Okay, let's watch what happens with the smugness. So the smugness persists. And then at some point, the exercise involves my sitting in a chair, and John is to get up and very lightly touch my back and my shoulders and so forth. So John does this, and he touches me, and something, maybe I projected or who knows what, something about the quality of his touch was very childlike to me, very curious, exploratory, etc. And then almost like a artillery shell, the smugness just exploded and was gone. And it's like, whoa, And my way of understanding it, this is an interpretation, but my way of understanding it was, this was my way of coping with my mortality. John is older. John has leathery skin. John has cataracts. John has whatever you call those ear things. And so he's the one who's going to die. I'm not going to die. I'm in the forever young. That's what I called it in the chapter. I'm in the forever young group. He's in the going to die old fart group. Okay? So what I had done was what is called in Buddhist psychology, bhava, B-H-A-V-A. It's becoming. We have three ways of dealing with suffering: sensual desire, give me the ice cream, and whatever, becoming and non-becoming. So I had, in that moment, created an identity of being the forever young one. And I need a foil. I need another other to create that, to sustain that in any way. So John became the old one. Okay? And when you think about it, what do we call, identity politics? This is pretty heavy duty stuff. If that might have just started just in that moment, but if for some reason I wasn't aware and so forth, as Thompson says, I could start to sustain this. And the more I sustain it, the more I am getting solid, rigid around it. Okay, and I start to also make John a certain kind of thing. There's a rigidity there. So the point is, we can think of identity, particularly if it's getting rigid, as this limited reactive self. Okay. And that's one way that I can deal with life is I, in a sense, belong to the Forever Young group or whatever other groups I belong to. I get more and more solid, if you will, around that. And if you want to read more about this notion of the story of me, Rodney Smith has a wonderful book called Stepping Out of Self-Deception that talks about how we are very skilled in a way at getting ourselves to get off of the spiritual journey and back into some ways of kind of reinforcing this kind of self that we want to be or thinks that will allow us to succeed or be happy or whatever it may be. Now, of course, the other thing I can do, or that any of us can do, is we can be contemplative and self-examining. Okay, so it could take something like a workshop, like I was in. And again, I wanted to emphasize that I felt safe there. Okay, I knew the teacher, I knew John, it's a beautiful setting. That safety is very, very important, I think, to being able to have these kinds of insights and do this work. So please don't set yourself up in a sense by saying, oh, I wasn't able to do it because I'm not something good enough. No, maybe you didn't feel safe in that setting in order to do that kind of work. But the point being, sometimes it takes a crisis of some kind. Maybe your partner or some kind of relationship has, blown up or whatever. Maybe you've just found out about a serious illness. Maybe you just found out about the loss of someone, something with your job or whatever. And crisis sometimes is defined as a dangerous opportunity. In Mindful Self-Compassion, which Jennifer Stanley and I sometimes teach together, we talk about AFGOs, another effing growth opportunity. Okay? But the point is that these things, rather than being reactive, if we can allow ourselves to pause and just tune into what's going on, perhaps we can be more responsive, not just reflexively reactive to what's happening. Okay? And again, as we're able to do that, this identity has less and less of a hold on us, okay? And the whole idea of identity, self, and so forth maybe becomes a little bit, maybe it even feels a little, who am I? What am I? I thought I was this, but who am I? Okay. And so as one psychologist put it, Jack Engler, in a book's Transformations of Consciousness, he said, roughly, we need to develop ourself before we can let go of ourself. We need to develop ourself before we can let go of ourself. All right? And this sets us up to experience what? The transcendent, the selfless, what is sometimes called non-dual. Greetings, Jeff, and Arjuna, if I have that right. And so this is this idea of anatta from the inside out. Okay. Now there can be a temptation to turn the conditioned self into a villain. If I could just get rid of this conditioned self that causes such suffering and so forth, everything would be fine. And notice that the guidance that Jack Engler gives, though, is not to get rid of ourself, but to develop ourself. Okay? Think of the Brahma Viharas, for example. Metta, compassion, mudita, empathetic joy, okay, equanimity, that idea of being independent of the vicissitudes of life in terms of our mood and how we're feeling and how we're thinking about ourselves and so forth. What are those things about? They're really about cultivating the sense of self, okay? It's not about, this non-self. Again, I think it probably sets us up to experience transcendent states, but Brahma Viharas really are about, perfecting the self, if you will, okay? And so spiritual bypass sometimes, though, can be used as trying to do an end run around this. Oh, this conditioned self, it's just all it does is cause trouble and problems. And But if I can just, get into these states of absorption and concentration and so forth, the hindrances fall away, and it's all beautiful. And that's really what I need to do. But again, if that's as Irvin Yalom, I'm a psychologist, by the way, as Irvin Yalom, who's another psychologist, existential psychologist who has passed away, said, unfortunately, we have to go through our feelings and issues and stuff. We can't do an end run around them to heal them. Okay. So at the same time, these transcendent, selfless experiences, states of mind and so forth, they're pretty cool. They're wonderful. We go on retreat, we experience some things that are pretty darn cool. And again, but they're not the be all and the end all. We still, all of us, have to navigate life. We've got to chop the wood and carry the water, whether we're, quote, enlightened, awakened, or whether we're just a good old non-awakened, non-enlightened person. All right. And the Buddha is included in this. The Buddha was a human being. When he got older, he had a bad back. He'd begin a talk, turn it over to a trusted monastic, and listen while lying down. And I like to think of him as the pioneer, assuming the talk was okay, of being able to say, I approve this message. So the point is that we've all got to deal with life, all right? So what are some of the functions then of this self? Whether we want to think of it as conditioned self or however we want to think of it. Let me suggest it has a much broader range than we normally like to think of. Probably not a household word you use very often, but asomatonosia, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, asomatonosia is a disorder. Brick Johnstone thinks of this as a disorder of the self, a disorder of the self. Asomatonosia is, for example, I say to Jeff, meaning me, I say to Jeff, let's say, can you wiggle your hand, please, so I can see how it works? And I go, well, I would be happy to, except it's not my hand. Well, what are you talking about? It's your hand. It's attached to your, I don't know how it got there, but it's not my hand. It's here. It does things, but it's not my hand. So the point is, one way of thinking about this is a disorder of the self. I have disintegrated when it came to my knowing that this is a part of this body. Okay. And then there is something, for example, called, let's see if I can find it here, Capgras, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, syndrome, which is the non-recognition of family members as family members. Okay. What if you don't recognize thoughts as, in a sense, your thoughts, although that gets a little tricky with Buddhist psychology? Well, that's a thought disorder. It's a disorder of the self, which, can manifest as schizophrenia or whatever. So I think Brick Johnstone, again, has an interesting way of thinking about this. He thinks of this as a deficit of mineness, of ownership, my hand, my thoughts, my feelings, my relatives, or whatever. Okay? And so this to me, again, helps me to appreciate Jack Engler's encouragement to develop the self. Self is really needed. I mean, it's pretty hard to navigate the world if I'm convinced that, this is not my hand, if I don't know who my family members are and so forth. And again, the idea is that the self, the ego, one's identity is not the bad guy. The question is, how do we cultivate it? So I like to think about sila, ethical conduct, as the key to the wholesome development of self. And spiritual bypass is really, it means it's like an addiction. It's a way of avoiding dealing with that cultivation, because as we all know, that cultivation can be rather challenging. We have to deal with some interesting and oftentimes painful things. Okay? So Sila, and I think Sila is embodied in some ways in the Brahma Viharas, ethical conduct. It gives us a benchmark in a sense for how we might proceed to develop the self. Um, okay. Let's see, where do I want to go to from here? Okay. So this notion of ownership is a rather interesting one, I think. And most of the disorders that Brick Johnstone talked about in some of his articles, I heard him at an American Psychological Association presentation, deal with either confusion or a deficit, under ownership. You know, this isn't my hand, these are not my thoughts, etc. Well, what about disorders, or more generally, the idea of suffering that might be associated with over ownership? What do I mean by that? Well, here's one way of putting it. A friend was over at our house and met my father-in-law, and sometimes he can be rather quiet and so forth, but he sure knew that our friend had a rather nice car, a nice Lexus sports car. He was on top of that. There's a sense of, again, that our society is organized around and values ownership. You know, this person must be okay, successful in some way if they, are driving that kind of car. I play a lot of tennis. I think I am known among my tennis buddies as owning, if you will, a pretty good tennis game. You may have heard Aaron Rodgers, the quarterback for the Packers, bragged about, in relation to the Chicago Bears, he said, "I've owned you all my bleeping life. I own you, I still own you," meaning almost every time he played against them, he would win. Okay? Isn't that a rather interesting way of, presenting that sense of owning you? When people suffer serious illnesses, let's say, they may talk about losing key parts of their identity. Maybe they can't neurologically do the things that they did before. Maybe physically, I can't play tennis anymore or something. Well, it's as if I've lost part of myself, like I lost an arm or I've lost a part of my identity. And maybe I both grieve that and fear that others, why would anybody want to pay attention to me if I can no longer play tennis or whatever it may be? Well, let's take this even farther. What about owning land? Perhaps land that's been taken, conquered, stolen. Our house is situated on what was inhabited by the Piscataway. For some cultures, the whole idea of land ownership is inconceivable. It's not thought of, it's not conceived of in that way. Then there's the ownership of sentient beings. Slavery typically used in the case of human beings. Or are they human beings or are they property? What are they? Okay. Well, all right. So I don't want to get into big debates about whether humans are property or how to conceptualize land and so forth. I'll be with the Buddha. I'll stick with suffering and the end of suffering. And what I'm trying to suggest is I'm thinking that this is a source of suffering. Okay. And that's what I'd like to go for. So what I'm trying to say is, suffice it that having stuff, if you've ever seen George Carlin's riff on stuff, over ownership could be thought of as only reinforcing our delusion of self. If that makes sense? Of reifying the self, solidifying the self, and in that sense contributes to suffering. So let me develop that a little bit. And Glenn, this is your cue. Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, as I think has to be considered one of the most significant works of fiction in American USA history, if not in maybe all of history in some ways. Abraham Lincoln was reputed to say, can we get the picture of him up there? Maybe not. Oh, here it comes. There he is. Abraham Lincoln was reputed to say, quote, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Okay. That's in Connecticut, by the way. Okay. Thank you, Glenn. So I think one of the key contributions of this book is Stowe's emphasis on the suffering not only of slaves, but also of owners. It's really quite brilliant in that way. And there's many examples I could give, but let me give this one. This is Mrs. Shelby. Mrs. Shelby's talking. She's the wife of Mr. Shelby. And she's saying this upon learning that two of the slaves that she loves, if you will, are going to be sold. And she says, "This is God's curse on slavery, a bitter, bitter, most accursed thing, a curse to the master and a curse to the slave. I was a fool to think I could make anything good out of such a deadly evil. It is a sin to hold a slave under laws like ours. I always felt it was. I always thought so when I was a girl. I thought so still more after I joined the church, but I thought I could gild it over. I thought by kindness and care and instruction, I could make the condition of mine better than freedom, of my slaves, better than freedom. Fool that I was." Okay, so let me just say, without getting into it a whole lot, the cognitive dissonance, the rationalizations going on that you see in the book are frankly rampant. When Mrs. Shelby realizes Mrs. Shelby realizes she's not going to be able to persuade her husband, she becomes almost childlike. She says, "Here's my expensive watch. Certainly that would at least save Eliza's child," one of the slaves being sold. And he says, "Sorry, very sorry, Emily," and goes on to explain the deal's already done. When I read this scene, I just remember being somehow overcome by it. And it's like, here are two people, the Shelbys, trapped and lost in a system in which they're prisoners themselves. Okay? Supposedly they're the slave owners, and in some ways they're the ones in many ways that feel trapped. And all I could think of was Twilight Zone. I hope some of you are at least familiar with Twilight Zone, if you weren't familiar with the Certs Candy Mint. Some of you are? Okay, in Twilight Zone, there's these sort of science fiction 30-minute shows that were pretty remarkable. And Rod Serling or Rod Sterling? I can't remember which. Anyway, Sterling, thank you, Jeff.
Serling, no, S-E-R.
S-E-R, Serling? Thank you. So I had it right, yes. Rod Serling, so I couldn't resist, but here's my way of presenting what would be the Twilight Zone here. So picture, if you will, if you know Rod Serling, he's got his jacket on and so forth. And he says, "Mr. Shelby, plantation owner, is an affable man who finds himself playing hardball where he should not. Mrs. Shelby is an attractive, elegant lady who pretends she can offer more than the fruits of freedom to her slaves by teaching them to be good Christians. He is a failure and feels forced to do something that he knows will traumatize his wife. She, trapped in her role, will be dethroned from her goddess-like benevolence and resort to childlike responses. The economic system in which they live enslaves them as much as the slaves they own. They normally think, though, that they are free and resort to delusion until they meet their fate in the Twilight Zone." Anyways, that would be the flavor of an introduction that he would give to an episode. And I'd like to underscore that part of their suffering, particularly as emphasized with Mrs. Shelby, is the incongruence with which she has to live her life. This is a phrase that was used by Carl Rogers, a therapist back in the 60s and 70s, I believe. And the idea of congruence is the notion that, are we living our lives congruently? If we have certain values, Are our actions, speech, livelihood, think Noble Eightfold Path, if you will, are they in congruence with the values, with our right view, with our intentions, and so forth? If they're not, we suffer. Okay? So, in that sense, she suffers tremendously. And yet she's caught in this system that she's trapped in. And she comes up with this sort of rationalization that somehow she's going to make the slaves better than they could have been because she's going to teach them to be good Christians, and then they'll even be better than they were before. Okay? So this ownership, I believe, fuels desire and possessiveness. It's a powerful, powerful condition. And the proliferation, the papancha, proliferation of thought, only tends to amplify the suffering. And so certainly I think at least the case of slavery strikes me as a severe case of over ownership. And I would argue that it might be a very interesting practice for all of us to look at the things that we, quote, own, and be able to say, well, what is my motivation? Everything rests on the tip of one's motivation. What is my motivation for owning this car or this house or, even this profession or the things that we call mine, even the very act of calling it mine, if self is a process that is constructed and deconstructed moment to moment, what does it mean for anything in a sense to be mine? And when you think about it, one of the things that I feel like I've learned from Aya Dhammadippa is understanding better the practices that she does as a nun, as a monastic. I remember one time, if I may say, both of the Jennifers also were involved in this retreat and part of this 6-month program, teaching program that we were involved in. At one point, somebody asked her to say, well, what kinds of food do you like? And she was like, no. You bring me an offering, I accept the offering, and then, obviously if I have an allergy or something, I may not eat it, but no, you're only setting me up to start to reinforce desires. If I want this to be my food. So it strikes me as a very interesting dynamic to reflect on. Okay, then by way of closing, let me share two things. I was talking to a client, and this individual was talking about missing teaching. And at first I thought, again, sort of this idea of his identity wrapped up in that kind of thing. But no, actually what he missed, he said, was the sense of self-awareness, but not self-consciousness in teaching. In other words, he had taught long enough that he could just let it unfold. He could just be present with what was going on moment to moment. And that it was as if the self was missing the experience of selflessness in the teaching, if that makes sense. Does that make sense, folks? As if the self was missing that experience of selflessness in the teaching. I experience this sometimes in tennis, where I know I can't hit that shot, if you will. Somehow it was a selfless shot. It went beyond, this conditioned self. And one way to think about this also is as a teacher, it's been very helpful for me to think of this as I am a transmitter, a speaker of the Dharma, as best I can do it, and literally like a speaker in a stereo system. So I speak, I offer the Dharma. Notice what I did there. I offer the Dharma is offered. One person may say, oh my God, this is transformative. This is amazing. Another person may go, what is he talking about? I don't get this. But I can let go of that now. And prior to this, I had quite a bit of anxiety around public speaking. I would think that somehow I was supposed to magically be able to talk to each and every person and really connect with each and every one. Well, a speaker doesn't do that. The speaker just offers what it offers, and people take in what they take in. And so I was able to let go of that, owning it of sorts. And then to bring it full circle with the idea of death and dying, let me close with a quote from Lord Tennyson, and then a quote. Well, we'll just go with Lord Tennyson. So he describes transcendent experiences as follows. He says, quote, "A kind of waking trance, this for lack of a better word, I have frequently had quite up from boyhood when I have been quite alone. All at once, as it were, out of the intensity of the consciousness of individuality, individuality itself seemed to dissolve and fade away into boundless being. And this was not a confused state, but the clearest, the surest of the sure, utterly beyond words, where death was almost a laughable impossibility, the loss of the personality, if so it were, seeming no extinction, but only the true life." Okay. So I hope you've gotten some appreciation for the idea how cultivating one's sense of self actually can complement and contribute to our capacity to experience selfless states and so forth. And that how maybe a little bit about how spiritual bypass is not the road, and that also that it would be very helpful perhaps to take a look at one's relationship to those things that you think of as owning, whether it be attributes about yourself or material objects and so forth. So thank you for your attention very much. And